The judge believed the situation was simple. A custody order had been signed, a visitation schedule approved, and a mother instructed to comply. But by the time police arrived at the house, the child was already gone. No screaming, no panic, no attempt to escape. Just a woman standing silently at the door of a quiet suburban home, knowing the decision she had already made would likely destroy the rest of her life. Because in that moment, Elizabeth Morgan believed something worse than prison was possible. She believed the system itself was wrong. And once someone reaches that conclusion, everything changes. This is the story of a custody battle that escalated into one of the most disturbing legal conflicts in modern American family court history. A case involving allegations that divided experts, judges, politicians, and the public itself. A case where a successful surgeon chose jail over compliance, and where a child disappeared into another country, while the legal system struggled to answer a question it could no longer control. But to understand how any of this happened, you first have to understand Elizabeth Morgan, before the prison cell. Because stories like this rarely begin with one decision. They begin slowly, quietly, inside ordinary lives. And at first glance, Elizabeth Morgan's life looked anything but unstable. She was intelligent, highly educated, disciplined, the kind of person who worked in environments where mistakes carried permanent consequences. As a plastic surgeon, precision wasn't optional. Control was everything. Every movement mattered. Every decision carried risk. People trusted her with their bodies, with irreversible outcomes. And over time, that kind of professional life changes the way a person thinks. Surgeons are trained to rely on judgment, to act decisively under pressure, to trust their assessment, even when uncertainty exists. In medicine, hesitation can become danger. And that mindset, the belief that your judgment may be the only barrier to catastrophe, can slowly move beyond the operating room. By the time her marriage began collapsing, Elizabeth Morgan was already someone accustomed to responsibility, structure, control. Her husband, Eric Foritich, was also a medical professional, a dentist, educated, successful. From the outside, they appeared stable. Two accomplished professionals, building a life around career, reputation, family. But divorces rarely collapse all at once. They begin with small fractures no one else sees.
Arguments become routines. Silence becomes normal. Resentment stops being temporary and becomes structural. Eventually, the relationship no longer functions as a partnership. By the time the separation intensified into a custody conflict, the emotional atmosphere had already deteriorated. At the center of everything was their daughter, Hillary. And like many custody disputes, the conflict stopped being only about the marriage. It became about fear, about trust, about which parent the system believed represented safety. Then, the allegations began. Elizabeth Morgan started making serious claims about her daughter's well-being during contact with her father. Claims of abuse, claims that immediately transformed the dispute into something darker. Because once allegations involving a child enter family court, everything changes. The emotional stakes become unbearable. Every interaction becomes suspicious. Every behavioral detail becomes evidence to someone. And the legal system suddenly finds itself evaluating something impossible: fear. Not proven events, not certainty, fear. And fear inside custody battles is complicated. Sometimes it comes from real danger, sometimes from paranoia, manipulation, psychological collapse, or trauma created by the divorce itself. And sometimes not therapists, not lawyers, not judges can determine where the truth actually ends.
That uncertainty became the center of the Morgan case. Because the system didn't encounter clarity, it encountered contradiction. Experts were brought in, evaluations conducted, interviews completed, but instead of producing certainty, they produced division. Some assessments raised concern. Others concluded there was insufficient reliable evidence, and that created the exact situation family courts struggle with most. A child at the center of conflicting narratives, one parent insisting danger exists, the other insisting the allegations are false, and a court forced to rule despite incomplete certainty. Because courts cannot wait for absolute truth, they must decide, even when everything feels unresolved. As the dispute intensified, the emotional pressure grew heavier, and the relationship between Elizabeth and the system began deteriorating. This matters because many legal conflicts stop being about the original issue and become psychological battles over trust and authority. Once someone believes the system cannot protect them, compliance collapses. Every ruling feels dangerous. Every decision feels disconnected from reality. And the system stops looking neutral. It starts looking threatening. For Elizabeth Morgan, that psychological shift became absolute. Until the court made a decision, Eric Foritich would receive unsupervised visitation. Legally, a procedural ruling. Emotionally, an explosion. For Elizabeth, it wasn't a ruling. It was a catastrophe. And while the court believed it had resolved the conflict, she was already considering something far more extreme. Something that would turn a custody battle into an international disappearance. There are moments in legal cases that never appear in official documents. No transcript records them, no judge writes them down, no legal filing captures them. But they are often the moments where everything actually changes. In the Morgan custody case, that moment came on a night that, on the surface, looked completely ordinary. A scheduled visitation was approaching, a date already set by the court, a time already agreed upon, a procedure that, in theory, was meant to be simple. A child would be handed over to her father, as ordered, as expected, as required. But inside the home where Elizabeth Morgan lived, nothing about that night felt simple. There is a particular kind of silence that appears before irreversible decisions. Not calm silence, not peaceful silence, but a heavy, compressed silence, where every object in a room feels like it is waiting for something to happen. That is the kind of atmosphere witnesses later described in similar custody conflicts. And according to accounts of this case, the situation surrounding Elizabeth Morgan had reached exactly that kind of psychological pressure point. Because by this stage, the custody dispute was no longer just about legal disagreement. It had become something internal, a conflict between institutional authority and personal conviction, between court rulings and perceived danger. And once that kind of conflict takes root in a person's mind, rational compromise becomes increasingly difficult. On one side, there was the legal expectation. A court order had been issued. Visitation had been approved. Compliance was required. On the other side, there was Elizabeth Morgan's belief that the decision exposed her daughter to harm she could not accept. And between those two positions, there was no middle ground left that felt safe to her. This is where custody battles often become psychologically irreversible, because the system assumes that disagreement still allows compliance. But emotionally, some individuals reach a point where compliance itself feels like participation in harm, and that belief changes everything. As the night progressed, preparations were expected to happen. Luggage, transportation, transfer of custody. But instead, something else occurred. Not an argument, not a confrontation, but a decision. Quiet, final, executed without announcement. Hillary was not delivered for the scheduled visitation. She did not arrive at the designated time, and by the time authorities became aware, the situation had already moved beyond a simple violation. Because Elizabeth Morgan had not merely delayed compliance, she had removed her daughter from the expected jurisdiction entirely. The plan that followed was not improvised. According to later accounts, it involved coordination, preparation, external assistance. The child was taken out of the country, New Zealand, far enough to complicate enforcement, far enough to delay intervention, far enough to change the entire structure of the dispute. And once authorities realized what had happened, the case transformed. What had been a domestic custody conflict became an international child custody enforcement crisis. The system was no longer dealing with non-compliance inside its own jurisdiction. It was dealing with disappearance across borders. Urgency increased. Court orders that once took months became emergency directives, information requests, legal pressure, demands for disclosure. The question was no longer about custody rights. It was simple. Where is the child? But the answer never came. When authorities demanded that Elizabeth Morgan reveal Hillary's location, she refused. Not partially, not conditionally, not temporarily. The refusal was absolute. Contempt of court followed, a mechanism meant to enforce compliance, not punish past crime. And unlike criminal sentencing, contempt has no fixed duration. It lasts as long as compliance is considered possible. Days passed, then weeks, then months. No disclosure, no cooperation, no compromise. The case shifted from custody dispute to constitutional question, a system trying to enforce authority, an individual refusing to break, and between them, a child whose location remained unknown. By the time the legal system fully understood what had happened, the situation was no longer reversible through normal procedures. A custody order had been violated. A child had been taken across international borders, and the mother responsible for that decision was refusing to disclose any information about her whereabouts. In most legal disputes, there is always a path back to compliance. A fine, a revised order, a mediated agreement. But this case had moved beyond that structure, because the key variable was no longer legal disagreement. It was silence. And silence inside a courtroom is not neutral. It becomes resistance. Once authorities confirmed that Hillary had been taken out of the country, the entire case escalated into a different category of enforcement. No longer a private custody matter, now an international recovery situation. Agencies were involved, legal channels expanded, requests crossed borders. But even with increased pressure, one fact remained unchanged. The child could not be located through official cooperation, and the only person who had that information was refusing to speak. Inside courtrooms, judges typically assume that legal pressure eventually produces compliance. Even in difficult cases, there is usually a breaking point, a moment where consequences outweigh resistance. But Elizabeth Morgan did not reach that point in the expected way, because every time the court issued another order demanding disclosure, the response remained the same. No information was provided, no location was revealed, no compromise was offered. And as this pattern continued, the case began to take on a psychological dimension that extended beyond legal enforcement, because what the court was now facing was not simply a violation of custody terms. It was a sustained act of refusal that challenged the effectiveness of judicial authority itself, and that created pressure at every level of the system.
Inside the courtroom, hearings became repetitive. The same question, the same demand, the same silence in response. Where is the child? It is difficult to overstate how central that question became, because every legal mechanism in place depended on its answer. Without it, enforcement had no endpoint, and without an endpoint, detention became open-ended by design. That is where contempt of court entered its most controversial form, not as punishment for a completed offense, but as coercion intended to force future compliance, a legal pressure system designed to break refusal through time. And time, in this case, began to accumulate in a way no one anticipated. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Months blurred into a continuous stretch of legal standoff. Inside detention, there was no trial determining guilt in the criminal sense. There was no sentencing for a traditional crime. Instead, there was a single condition governing release: provide the information, and the detention would end. Refuse, and it would continue. That structure created one of the most difficult legal paradoxes in modern family law, because it meant that the duration of confinement was not fixed by a judge at sentencing. It was determined entirely by compliance after the fact. And in practice, that meant potentially indefinite detention. Outside the courtroom, the case began to attract increasing attention, not only because of the custody dispute itself, but because of what the enforcement mechanism represented: a mother detained without a criminal conviction, held not for what she had done in the past, but for what she refused to reveal in the present. This distinction became the center of public debate. Some viewed it as necessary protection of a child's welfare. Others viewed it as an unacceptable extension of judicial power. And between those two interpretations, there was no simple resolution. Meanwhile, the absence of the child created an additional layer of uncertainty that intensified the emotional weight of the case. Because Hillary was no longer just part of a custody dispute on paper, she had become a missing presence at the center of a legal standoff with no sign of resolution. Inside the system, pressure built from multiple directions. Legal authorities demanded disclosure. Defense arguments challenged coercive detention. Judges balanced enforcement with proportionality. And all of it circled back to a single unresolved point: the location of the child remained unknown to the court. As time passed, that fact became increasingly destabilizing. Because legal systems are designed around resolution. Cases move forward, judgments are made, outcomes are enforced. But this case resisted that structure entirely. Instead of resolution, it produced continuation. Instead of closure, it produced repetition. A system locked in place, a refusal locked in place, and a child still outside the court's reach. At this stage, the case expanded beyond family law, into broader legal and governmental attention, because what was unfolding was no longer just one custody dispute. It was a test of the limits of judicial enforcement itself. How far can a legal system go when its authority is directly resisted? And what happens when the mechanism designed to enforce compliance no longer produces compliance at all? Inside detention, the same question continued: where is the child? And the same answer continued: nothing. No disclosure, no cooperation, no change. Until what remained was a structural deadlock. A legal system still issuing orders, a mother still refusing to comply, and a child still missing from the court's reach. There is a point in every prolonged legal conflict where the case stops feeling like a case. It stops feeling like paperwork, stops feeling like hearings, stops feeling like something with structure and progression. And instead, it starts feeling like a closed system, a loop that never resolves. In the Morgan custody case,
That shift became unmistakable once the detention entered its extended phase. Because what had begun as a custody enforcement action was no longer moving toward resolution. It was simply continuing, day after day, with no visible change in outcome.
Inside the detention system, Elizabeth Morgan was no longer waiting for a trial verdict in the traditional sense. There had already been hearings. There had already been rulings. There had already been legal justification established on paper. What remained was something more unusual, a condition for release that never activated. Provide the information, end the detention. Refuse, and the detention continues. On its surface, the structure appeared simple, but in practice, it created something far more complex. Because it removed the concept of a fixed sentence. There was no date on a calendar marking the end, no predetermined length of punishment, no final stage automatically reached over time. Instead, time itself became the mechanism of enforcement. And that is where legal theory and human psychology begin to collide. Because systems assume that continued pressure eventually produces change, that isolation leads to cooperation, that time leads to reconsideration, that consequences eventually outweigh resistance. But that assumption only holds when the person inside the system still accepts the system as legitimate. In Elizabeth Morgan's case, that legitimacy was already in question long before the detention began. And once that belief breaks, coercion stops functioning the way it was designed to. Inside the facility, the environment itself was unremarkable on the surface. No dramatic conditions, no extraordinary setting, just containment. Walls, schedules, routine. But psychologically, routine without endpoint has a different effect than routine with structure. Because structure implies progression, and progression implies exit. But here, exit was not tied to time. It was tied to compliance. And compliance, in this case, was absolute. Reveal the child's location or remain detained. That binary created the central tension of the entire case, because it transformed detention from a consequence into a negotiation. Not between two equal parties, but between an individual conviction and institutional authority. And neither side appeared willing to shift. As weeks turned into months, and months extended further, the outside world began reacting more intensely. What had once been a private custody dispute was now visible at a national level. Media coverage increased. Legal analysts weighed in. Public opinion fractured. Some viewed the situation through a protective lens, a mother refusing to expose her child to perceived harm. Others viewed it through a legal lens, a court order being deliberately defied with no accepted endpoint. And between those two interpretations, there was no stable middle ground, because the missing variable remained unresolved. The child's location was still unknown to the court. That fact alone prevented closure. Every legal argument returned to it. Every enforcement discussion circled it. Every justification depended on it. Inside the courtroom, hearings repeated with increasing tension. The same exchange, the same demand, the same refusal. Where is the child? No answer. Again, where is the child? No answer. Over time, repetition changes its meaning. At first, procedural, then frustrating, then symbolic. Eventually, it becomes confrontation itself, not between individuals, but between systems of belief. Because at this stage, the case was no longer just about custody law. It was about whether judicial authority could compel disclosure, when the person being compelled no longer accepted that authority's legitimacy. And that is where contempt of court becomes most controversial,
because it is not designed to punish a completed action. It is designed to force a future one. But when the future action never comes, the mechanism has no internal termination point. That is what made this case so difficult to resolve. Coercive detention based on refusal creates a structure that depends entirely on eventual compliance. And in this case, that compliance never arrived. As time extended, the psychological weight intensified on both sides. Inside detention, uncertainty became the defining condition. The requirement was known, the outcome was known, but the willingness to meet that requirement remained absent. Outside, pressure shifted into political discussion. Questions about proportionality, due process, limits of coercive authority. Meanwhile, the absence of the child remained the center of everything. Where is the child? No answer. And with every repetition, the structure tightened. A court insisting on disclosure, a mother refusing entirely, a system continuing to hold someone whose only path to release required breaking a belief she would not abandon. That is where the case stood. Not progressing, not resolving, but continuing. At first, the Morgan custody case existed entirely inside the boundaries of family court. A divorce dispute, a custody disagreement, a series of allegations that the legal system attempted to evaluate through experts, hearings, evidence review. But there is a threshold in legal conflicts where a case stops belonging to the individuals involved and begins belonging to the system itself. In this case, that threshold was crossed the moment the detention did not end. Because what the courts expected to be a temporary enforcement mechanism had turned into something far more difficult to contain. A custody dispute with no visible endpoint. A detention dependent entirely on compliance that never arrived. And a child whose location remained unknown to the court that had ordered her return. That combination created pressure the system was not fully designed to absorb indefinitely. At first, attention came from legal observers, family law specialists, judges familiar with contempt proceedings, attorneys analyzing coercive enforcement tools. Because on paper, the mechanism used in this case was not unusual in itself. Contempt of court is a standard legal instrument. It exists to enforce compliance with judicial orders, not through punishment for past actions, but through continued detention until a required action is performed. In theory, it is simple. In practice, it depends on one critical assumption, that the person under detention will eventually choose compliance. But in the Morgan case, that assumption began to collapse over time. And once it collapsed, the structure of the case changed entirely. Because now, the detention no longer had a natural termination point. It did not end after a set number of days. It did not conclude after a defined sentence. It did not resolve through standard procedural progression. Instead, it continued as long as the court believed compliance was still possible. And that distinction is where legal theory begins to clash with political reality. Because systems built on indefinite coercion generate questions that extend beyond the courtroom. How long is too long? At what point does enforcement become punishment? And who decides when a coercive mechanism has exceeded its intended purpose? These questions began to emerge publicly as the case extended further into time. But before they became political questions, they were already psychological ones. Inside the detention itself, the structure of time changed meaning. Days no longer functioned as progression markers. They became repetitions. Each day, similar to the one before it. Each interaction governed by the same unresolved condition. Where is the child? And the answer remained unchanged. No disclosure, no cooperation, no deviation from position. From a legal perspective, this created a deadlock. From a procedural perspective, it created stagnation. But from a human perspective, it created something harder to define. Because there was no visible transformation, no negotiation, no partial compromise, no gradual shift toward resolution. Only continuation. Outside the detention system, however, the case began to evolve in a different direction entirely. Media coverage increased significantly. What had once been a local custody dispute was now being discussed nationally. Not because custody disputes are rare, but because this one no longer behaved like a standard custody dispute. It had become a legal anomaly, a case that did not resolve through normal procedural pathways. And once a case becomes an anomaly, it stops being private. It becomes symbolic. Different groups began interpreting it through different frameworks. For some observers, the central issue remained child protection, a mother who believed she was preventing harm. For others, the issue was legal authority, a court order deliberately violated and not corrected through compliance. And between those interpretations, no consensus emerged, because the missing variable remained unchanged. The court still did not know where the child was. That fact alone prevented closure. Every argument eventually returned to it. Every justification, every criticism, every legal analysis circled back to the same unresolved point. And as long as that point remained open, the case could not stabilize.
Meanwhile, political attention began to grow, not immediately in the form of legislation, but in the form of concern. Because prolonged detention without criminal conviction introduces questions that extend beyond family law jurisdiction. Questions about due process, questions about proportionality, questions about the limits of coercive authority. Inside the courtroom, hearings continued. Repetition became the defining feature of proceedings. Where is the child? No answer. Where is the child? No answer. Over time, repetition changed character, from administrative to procedural, to adversarial, to symbolic of breakdown. Because systems are not designed for infinite repetition without resolution. They are designed to move forward. This case resisted that movement entirely, and that resistance became the defining characteristic of the entire conflict. As months accumulated, the legal structure began to strain under its own logic. Enforcement depended on compliance. Compliance depended on willingness. Neither condition was met. And so, the system remained in enforced stasis, continuing without progression. There is a point in prolonged custody conflicts where the legal arguments, the hearings, and the procedural language all begin to fade into the background. And what remains is the human absence at the center of it. In the Morgan case, that absence had a name: Hillary. But as time passed, the case stopped interacting with her as a present reality. Instead, she became something else: a reference point, a justification, a missing variable that every legal discussion returned to, but could no longer directly reach. Because once the child was taken out of the country, she was no longer part of the immediate courtroom dynamic. She was no longer present in hearings, no longer physically accessible to the system, no longer visible within the legal environment that was still actively debating her future. And that created a psychological shift, often overlooked in legal analysis. Because when a child is present in custody proceedings, decisions feel immediate. There is feedback, there is interaction, there is visible consequence. But when the child becomes geographically and legally distant, the case becomes abstract in a way that changes its emotional structure completely. And abstraction can intensify conflict because it removes grounding, it removes shared observation, it removes the possibility of real-time correction. Inside the legal system,
Hillary was now primarily present through documentation, reports, statements, prior evaluations, conflicting interpretations of past interactions. But none of those could replace physical presence in resolving uncertainty. And uncertainty is the condition that defined every stage of this case. For Elizabeth Morgan, Hillary was not an abstract variable. She was the reason for every decision that followed. Because in her perception, the custody outcome was not simply a legal disagreement. It was a direct evaluation of safety. And once a parent interprets custody decisions through the lens of safety rather than legality, the psychological stakes change entirely. Because legal systems operate on evidence thresholds, but parental perception often operates on perceived risk. And perceived risk does not require certainty to feel absolute. It only requires belief. This divergence between legal standard and personal conviction became one of the central tensions of the case, because the court required evidence, while Elizabeth Morgan's actions appeared to have been driven by certainty that did not depend on legal validation. And when those two frameworks collide, resolution becomes extremely difficult. Inside the courtroom, however, the focus remained procedural. The child's whereabouts were still required for enforcement. The custody order still stood, and the refusal to disclose location still defined the legal position of the case. But as time extended, something else began to emerge outside the legal framing: public perception. Because the absence of Hillary was no longer just a legal problem, it became an emotional anchor for public interpretation. Some viewed her as a child removed from a potentially harmful situation. Others viewed her as a child separated from a legal parent without judicial resolution. And between those interpretations, there was no shared foundation of certainty. That lack of certainty allowed the case to expand beyond its original boundaries. Because when facts are disputed and resolution is delayed, narratives begin to form in their place. And narratives tend to simplify complexity into moral positions. In the Morgan case, this simplification did not occur cleanly. Instead, it fractured into competing interpretations that made consensus impossible. But inside the legal system, interpretation did not matter as much as enforcement structure. And enforcement structure depended on one key element: access to the child. Without that access, the court's ability to resolve the custody order remained incomplete. And that incompleteness reinforced the ongoing nature of the contempt detention, a loop that had now extended far beyond initial expectations. Inside detention, the psychological reality of that loop remained consistent. The same question continued to define the case: where is the child? And the same answer continued to define the response: no disclosure, no deviation, no compromise. Over time, this repetition created a kind of structural stillness. Not resolution, not progress, but persistence. And persistence in a closed legal system often begins to resemble immobility. Meanwhile, outside the legal framework, the absence of Hillary began to take on a different symbolic weight. Because she was no longer just the subject of a custody dispute, she had become the center of a broader question that no single court hearing could resolve. What happens when two competing interpretations of protection cannot be reconciled through legal means? In most cases, the system resolves this through evidence clarity or compliance. But in this case, neither occurred. And as a result, Hillary remained physically absent from the legal process, while remaining conceptually central to it, a contradiction that created ongoing tension in every proceeding that followed. And that paradox would eventually force the system to confront limits it had not anticipated when the case first began. At some point, every legal case reaches what appears to be a natural ending point. Hearings slow down, orders stabilize, appeals run their course, and even the most complex disputes eventually return to some form of resolution. But in the Morgan custody case, that expectation never fully materialized, because even after years of legal proceedings, detention, political attention, and repeated court intervention, the central contradiction of the case remained intact. The court still did not have confirmed access to the child's location during the critical phases of the dispute, and the refusal to disclose that information had never changed. What remained instead was a structure that had extended far beyond its original legal purpose, a custody conflict that evolved into a prolonged enforcement deadlock, a detention mechanism that operated without a fixed endpoint, and a legal system continuing to apply coercive pressure in the absence of the very information it required to resolve the case. At the center of it all stood Elizabeth Morgan, a successful surgeon, a mother, and a figure at the center of one of the most debated custody enforcement cases in modern American legal history. Because technically, what made this case unusual was not only the emotional intensity or the allegations involved, it was the structure of the detention itself. There was no traditional criminal conviction underlying the confinement. Instead, the legal foundation rested on contempt of court, a mechanism designed not to punish past behavior, but to compel future compliance. In this case, that meant a single condition governed everything. Provide the information, reveal the child's location, comply with the court order, and the detention would end. Refuse, and it would continue. On paper, the logic appears straightforward. In practice, it creates something far more complex, because it removes the concept of a fixed sentence. There is no predefined duration, no automatic conclusion, no guaranteed endpoint. Instead, time becomes the mechanism itself, and that is where legal structure begins to collide with human psychology. Because systems assume that sustained pressure eventually produces change, that isolation leads to reconsideration, that repetition leads to compliance, that consequences eventually outweigh resistance. But those assumptions only hold when the individual still recognizes the system as a framework they are willing to re-enter. In the Morgan case, that condition was no longer stable. And once that stability breaks, coercion stops behaving predictably. Inside detention, the structure of time became uniform. Days did not represent progression anymore. They represented repetition. Each day defined by the same condition, each interaction returning to the same question, each refusal maintaining the same position. Where is the child? And the answer remained unchanged. No disclosure, no deviation, no negotiation. From a legal perspective, this created a deadlock. From a procedural perspective, stagnation. But from a structural perspective, something more unusual emerged. A system continuing without forward motion. A loop sustained by its own enforcement logic. Outside the courtroom, however, the case had already evolved into something broader. Media attention increased significantly. What began as a custody dispute confined to family court had become a national point of discussion. Not because custody conflicts were uncommon, but because this one no longer behaved like a typical custody conflict. It had become a legal anomaly, a case that resisted resolution through standard procedural pathways. And once a case becomes an anomaly, it stops being purely private. It becomes symbolic. Different groups began interpreting it through fundamentally different frameworks. For some, the case represented child protection, taken to its most extreme interpretation. A mother acting under the belief that she was preventing harm. For others, It represented an unacceptable breakdown of legal compliance, a court order deliberately defied and never corrected through cooperation. And between those interpretations, no stable consensus emerged, because the missing variable remained unchanged. The court still did not have access to the child's confirmed location. That single fact prevented closure at every level of analysis: legal, procedural, emotional. Every argument circled back to it. Every justification depended on it. Every critique returned to it.
And as long as it remained unresolved, the case could not stabilize into a final form. Meanwhile, political attention began to grow around the broader implications of the case, because prolonged detention without criminal conviction introduces questions that extend beyond family law. Questions about proportionality, due process, the limits of coercive authority. Inside the courtroom, proceedings continued in repetition. Where is the child? No answer. Where is the child? No answer. Over time, repetition stopped functioning as procedure and became the structure itself. A system enforcing its authority. A subject refusing to alter position, with no convergence point between them. In the end, the Morgan case became less about custody and more about the limits of legal structure itself, because it showed what happens when enforcement continues without the possibility of conclusion. Because in the eyes of the law, there are no accidents, only choices.